than one ineligible person to receive benefits. And I think that says a lot about the philosophy and the framework of the designers.
Well, it's one of the things that you just described, this system in which there is no human contact. It's really striking in reading the book, and in all the systems you described, to a greater or lesser extent, there's that exclusion of the human from the decision-making process. And what happened to the social services staff that worked there? Did they go to work in these call centers? Did they disappear? What are the implications for making hard human decisions automatic?
Yeah. So in the case of Indiana, the 1,500 caseworkers were promised that they would not lose their job, but that they would be transferred to private positions at the same rate of pay or greater. And that was true for some people. Though these regional call centers that I talk about were often 50 or 100 miles away from where folks lived. And they actually shifted the pay scale so that you got a base rate, and then a good portion of your salary was based on meeting performance targets. And performance targets included things like getting off the phone quickly and getting closing cases quickly. And so many of the caseworkers I spoke to, they said things to me like, we became slaves to the task system. Like, all we could do is respond to this electronic queue, and this isn't how we see our job. Like, we see our job as helping people navigate a really complicated social service bureaucracy to make sure that they get all of the benefits they're entitled to and deserve. And they felt like they couldn't do that. Most of them felt like they couldn't do that job within the new system. So by the time I did reporting in Indiana, which was in, say, 2012, 6 years after the automation, most folks had left. And so the caseworkers who I spoke to, or the retired caseworkers I spoke to, said, right when I asked them, like, how's it going now? Like, why aren't we hearing the kind of outcry about the system now as we did a couple of years ago? What they would say to me is the folks who understood that it had ever been different are gone. So they saw it very much as a labor issue as well, because the state public worker unions were under attack at the same time.
Okay, wow. One of the other things that's striking about the book is data, of course. You give great detail on how people are asked to provide huge amounts of incredibly personal data that goes into a system and then it disappears forever.
Yeah.
They can't necessarily get it back. They don't know what the future impacts will be. I was very struck by some of the child programs you discussed, where if your parents were in care as children, that's going to affect how they're perceived by the system as parents themselves. It was really very striking. And yet, at the same time, we hear a lot today about how people need to protect their data. It's a big issue here in Europe. The GDPR just went into effect last week. So what does this mean? That as a poor person, you do not have digital rights?
Right. It's a fantastic question. So one thing I want to do is make sure to refer everybody to a wonderful book called The Poverty of Privacy by Kiara Bridges. And she makes a really compelling argument that it's an ethnography of women who are navigating pregnancies while on Medicaid in New York City. And she makes a really strong argument that the right to privacy is not a right that poor and working people in the United States, and particularly African American poor folks in the United States, really have ever had. So I think it's important to acknowledge that it has long been a assumption in public services that you trade some of your basic rights for support. And so there's a way in which I think these digital tools are amplifying the historical some of the historical wrongs that have been present in the social services system for a long time. I think you've really sort of put your finger on a really important question, which is that when we talk about privacy and data rights and digital rights, we often think about them only from the point of view of people who are consumers of products like Facebook or Twitter or Instagram.
Your digital assistant emailed your conversation to the neighbor, but
exactly.
You need to be able to afford a digital assistant for that to be an issue.
And it really, I think the issues are the stakes are much clearer And the stakes are much higher when you talk about poor and working communities. And that's why I wrote the book, really, is to help people understand. There's that old saw by William Gibson that says the future is already here, it's just unevenly distributed. Yeah. And I agree with him on that, but I believe that we mean it in opposite ways. I believe William Gibson meant it that the future is here, but really rich people get the fancy tools first. Yeah. In the research that I did for this book, the future of digital surveillance is already here, but it lands first in poor and working neighborhoods.
Well, that's what you say at the start of the book. There's a conversation you had with a woman who said they're coming for you next. And I was very struck by that as well. You think this is a lack of privacy and a level of surveillance that will extend upwards towards middle classes as well?
Yeah, so I would like to say you're quoting Dorothy Allen, who's a good friend and comrade of mine who I've worked with on and off for 20 years. One of the origin stories of this book is a conversation I had with her 18 years ago, where she was talking about her electronic benefits transfer card, which is the debit-like card that you get public benefits on. And one of the things that she said about it was that her caseworker used it to track all of her purchases and all of her movements. And I must have looked very shocked and naive, because she kind of laughed at me for a minute. And then she got serious and said, what you just quoted, which is, you all should really be paying attention to this, meaning professional middle class people, because it's coming for you next. And I really believe that, one, that was very generous of her, and two, that it was incredibly sharp analysis of the situation we find ourselves in now. So if you look at the current U.S. administration, they've been signaling that there's a lot of cuts coming, particularly to social programs. It's really important to keep our eyes on that. But one of the things that I'm hearing less about is there's also been a lot of signaling that the kinds of data systems that we've been using for really almost 20 years in programs that are aimed at poor and working families are going to be imported into middle-class entitlements. So things like Social Security, unemployment, Medicare, disability, and I think we really need to be paying very close attention to that. Not because I think it wouldn't matter if it was only aimed at poor and working people, right? It matters if it's only aimed at poor and working people, but these tools are, I believe, going to be used more widely.
Well, that brings me to my last question before we take some from Facebook and the world. So here we are. We have a digital poorhouse. And is it too late to shape it, to have any influence on what it becomes? And what can be done?
Yeah, of course not. And one of the things that many of the stories I tell in the book are quite tough, or quite hard to hear. And I don't know that the book ends in an optimistic place, but I do believe it ends in a rousing place, or a hopeful place. I understand that often when I talk about the book, that what people most want is sort of a 5-point plan for creating better technologies, and I understand the impulse, I really do.
Is it technologies or policies, though? That's my other question.
But this is the question, right? So I believe that it shouldn't surprise us that when we build tools to be neutral, that our goal is for them to be neutral, to be objective, that they end up amplifying sort of the terrain of inequality that we already have. Right. So the metaphor I use when I talk to designers is like, look, we can't design a car with no gears to drive in a landscape that looks like San Francisco. And the landscape of inequality in the United States is full of very steep hills and very deep ravines and very twisty roads. And so we have to be building gears into the tools in order for them to really be able to respond to and overcome the kinds of inequalities we already have. If we build them in neutral, we can't then be surprised when they crash at the bottom of the hill.
Right.
And so I think right now what we're seeing is a lot of well-intentioned tools that were designed to be neutral, but weren't designed specifically to combat the inequalities that we see in the United States. So that, I think, is the take-home for designers, is that we have to start building from this historic point of view, from understanding context, from understanding the policy area in which you're working, in order to create better tools. But I think more broadly, the solutions are pretty deep because the problems are pretty deep.
Yeah.
So getting to the roots of these problems are really about telling different stories about poverty in the United States, right? We have this crazy story we tell that poverty is an aberration, is something that just happens to a small percentage of probably pathological people, and it's simply not true. So according to Mark Rank's wonderful life cycle work on poverty, 51% of us will be below the poverty line at some point in our adult life, and a full 2/3 of us will receive means-tested public assistance. So that's straight welfare, that's not reduced price school lunches, that's not Social Security, that's welfare. So this is a majority issue. Poverty is a majority experience in the United States. It doesn't mean we all experience it equally. If you're a person of color, if you're born poor, if you have physical disabilities or mental health issues, if you're caring for other people, then you're more likely to become poor, and it's harder to escape once you do. But poverty is already a majority issue. So the way that we create policy around it, that we're trying to correct people who end up in poverty rather than trying to correct poverty, right? It's fundamentally a mistaken approach. So I really believe that our punitive, means-tested forms of support have to shift to universal forms of support based on universal economic human rights. And that we have to use both our policy and our tools to make sure that we're protecting all of our values, not just efficiency, not just cost savings, but also dignity and self-determination and democracy and due process and equity. And I don't think we're there yet. Yeah.
Well, I'm afraid we have run out of time and we have to stop.
I'm sorry,
but
Facebook.
If you have one last thing you want to say to anyone, it's your platform.
Oh,
go.
Ooh, go. I appreciate the opportunity to be here and to talk with you all. I hope folks will read the book and engage in the conversation. And I also really hope to hear more great solutions from folks who are out there building tools. One of the greatest things about being on tour and talking about the book is that people often come up to me and they say, oh, we're working on this thing. So it's really exciting for me to hear about those new experiments, and I look forward to being part of that conversation.
Thank you so much.
Thank
it was
you
a
for
pleasure.
having me.
Thank you.
Yeah.